Ewan Carruthers had spent 11 years designing other people's dream homes, and the signed contract sitting on the passenger seat was the largest commission his firm had ever won. Enough to change things, enough to finally do what he had been promising himself for years. But none of that was what made his hands tighten on the wheel, as he turned off the 400 and headed north toward Heron Falls. What made his hands tighten was his mother's voice on the last phone call. She had said everything was fine. She always said that. But there had been something careful in how she said it. The way a person chooses their words when they are afraid of choosing the wrong ones. And Ewan had spent 11 years learning to read the places where something beautiful was about to fail. He had not called ahead. That was a decision he made somewhere around Barrie, with the gray fields spreading flat on both sides of the highway and the sky the color of old pewter. He wanted to see their faces before they had time to arrange them. He wanted the truth of the moment, not the performance. The contract was for a heritage restoration project in the distillery district, the kind of work that came around once in a career, if that. His name would be attached to a building that would outlast him by a century, and signing the papers that morning, all he could think about was his father at the kitchen table in Heron Falls, with the same chipped mug he'd been drinking from for 40 years, the one Harold Carruthers refused to throw away because, he said, everything still worth keeping had a chip in it somewhere. He pictured his mother, John Carruthers, at the window above the kitchen sink, watching the yard the way she always watched it, as though the garden required supervision even in October when nothing was growing. He thought about the wind chime Harold had made from old keys and fishing line that had hung by the front door since Ewan could remember. The sound of it, the specific sound, which had meant home in a way that nothing else had ever quite managed. He thought about telling them. He thought about the moment. He thought about nothing else for the last hour of the drive, and by the time the poplars along the county road appeared, bare, stripped early by the hard autumn, his chest was full of something so large he had trouble breathing around it. Then he noticed the faces. An older man coming out of the Co-op hardware store slowed when he saw the dark green Volvo. Recognition crossed his face, and then something else crossed it. Something Ewan could not name at speed, but that made him lift his foot from the gas without deciding to. A woman walking a dog near the post office stopped entirely. The dog kept going, the woman did not. Ewan told himself it was a small town. People noticed cars they didn't recognize. He turned left at the old grain elevator, still standing, still leaning at its same slight angle, as though the whole building had been trying for decades to hear something faint and could not quite make it out, and drove the last 4 blocks toward Birchwood Crescent. It was Ray Fenton who stopped him. Ray Fenton was 73 years old, and had known Harold Carruthers since before Ewan was born. He was standing at the edge of his own property doing nothing, which was unusual, just standing there with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes on the road, as though he had been expecting something. When Ewan rolled down the window, Ray didn't smile. Ewan. And then a pause that had too much inside it. Mr. Fenton, Ewan kept his voice easy, didn't expect to see you out in this. I'm always out here. Ray looked down the road toward the Carruthers house. Brief, deliberate. Didn't know you were coming back. I wanted to surprise them. Ray's mouth pressed flat. Your dad will be glad to see you. Would be. Past tense, dressed up as present. Ewan hadn't caught it the first time a person said it to him, but he caught it now, the way you catch a sound through a wall that you've been trying to convince yourself isn't there. Are they all right? Ewan asked. They're both alive. Ray said it quickly, the way a person gets ahead of the worst fear before it can take hold. They're both alive. But things have changed up here, Ewan. Things are always changing. Ray looked at him then, directly without looking away. Not like this. Ewan sat with his hands on the wheel. The engine ran quietly. Somewhere down the road a screen door opened and fell shut. Where are they? He asked. Ray's jaw worked. He looked at the gravel then back up. Go see the house first. He drove the last stretch of Birchwood Crescent slowly, his eyes reading the street the way he read architectural drawings. Looking for what was absent as much as what was present. The silver maple in his parents' yard had lost most of its leaves. The remaining ones shaking in the wind like they were trying to let go but couldn't quite manage it. The flower boxes his mother had hung and painted red the summer Ewan turned 9, because she said a house needed something that looked glad to be alive, were gone. In their place sat 2 plain gray pots, empty. The wind chime made of keys was not there. There was a truck in the driveway that did not belong to Harold Carruthers, and winter tires stacked against the side of the garage that did not belong to Harold Carruthers, and a front door mat that had never been there before. Ewan got out of the car. The door opened before he reached the porch. A man he had never seen stood in the frame. Late 30s, fleece jacket, the expression of someone prepared to manage a situation. He looked at Ewan with the particular calmness of a person who has been warned. Can I help you? I'm looking for Harold and Jean Carruthers. Something shifted in the man's face, very slightly. They don't live here. This is their house. I just rent the place. He shrugged slightly. I don't know anything about the previous owners. Previous owners. 2 words that rearranged everything. Ewan stood on the step Harold had poured himself one August afternoon, sweating and laughing at something on the radio, telling young Ewan to stop looking so worried because concrete was just dirt with ambition. He stood on that step and kept his breathing even and said thank you, and walked back to the car. Across the road, in the window of the blue bungalow where Lorna Fitch had lived for 30 years, a curtain moved. Ewan crossed the road. Lorna Fitch opened the door before he knocked. She was a small woman in her late 60s, white hair pinned at the back of her neck, a cardigan held tight across her chest despite standing indoors. She looked at Ewan the way people look at someone they have dreaded seeing, not with dislike, but with guilt that has been sitting too long in a small space. I saw you pull up, she said. They're not in the house, Ewan said. Where are they? She reached for the edge of the door. Her knuckles went pale. Your father tried so hard to hold on. To what? She looked past him toward the house. I should have called you. A lot of us should have, but your father, he was so certain he could manage it himself, and he was afraid of. She stopped. Of asking for help, Ewan said. Of being a burden. Her voice broke on the last word, quiet and small. That's how he put it. He said he didn't want to be anyone's burden. Ewan felt the back of his throat tighten in a way he did not expect. Harold Carruthers had never in his life been anyone's burden. He had driven Ewan to 17 hockey tournaments in 4 provinces. He had worked Saturdays for 3 years doing side jobs, so Ewan could finish school without debt. He had shoveled the driveway at 6 every winter morning because he said the day went better when the path was clear. The idea of that man, that specific quiet dignified man, afraid of being a burden pressed against something in Ewan's chest until the pressure was almost physical. Papers were signed, Lorna said. She was looking at her own hands now. Your brother came back in the spring. He said there were old debts. Said if something wasn't done quickly your parents would lose everything anyway. He said he was helping. He said he was helping. Ewan repeated it in his head. Where are they? He asked again. Lorna looked toward the back of the Carruthers property. Past the house, past the garage, to the old garden shed at the far edge of the yard. The one Harold had built in the late 90s for his tools and Jean's gardening supplies. The one they'd never quite gotten around to insulating properly because it was only ever meant to hold shovels. Ewan walked. He passed through the side gate of his parents' property, noting that the latch had been changed, that even this small replacement felt like an erasure, and crossed the dormant garden to the shed. A strip of yellow light showed under the door. He knocked. A pause, then his mother's voice, soft, confused, careful. Who's there? It's Ewan. A silence long enough to make him afraid he'd said the wrong thing. Then the door opened. Jean Carruthers looked at her son from the doorway of an uninsulated garden shed in mid-October, and for 3 full seconds neither of them moved. She was wearing 2 sweaters he recognized from years ago and a pair of men's work socks that were almost certainly Harold's. Her hair was down, which was unusual. Jean Carruthers had kept her hair pinned back for as long as Ewan could remember. A lot of small familiar things were absent, replaced by substitutions that told their story clearly without needing any explanation at all. Ewan. She said his name the way people say a prayer they had stopped believing in and then suddenly needed again. He stepped inside. The shed was maybe 4 meters by 3. Harold sat in the garden chair with the broken armrest, the one that had lived on the back porch for years, with a wool blanket across his lap that Ewan recognized as the one from the guest room. A battery lantern on the shelf between clay pots and old trowels. A camp stove on a folding table, 2 mugs, a cardboard box holding some folded clothes and a photograph in a frame face down. And on the shelf beside Harold's elbow a tin of soup opened, spoon resting in it, not on a burner, not heated, a tin of cold soup with a spoon in it sitting beside his father's hand. Ewan stopped looking at everything else, and looked at that. He looked at the tin, and at his father's hand resting next to it, and at the way Harold's fingers had gone very still, the moment the door opened, as though he had been caught doing something shameful, though the only shame in that shed had been put there by someone else entirely. Harold looked up. His eyes, the same dark gray as Ewan's, held everything at once: love, relief, humiliation, and the particular pain of a proud man who has run out of ways to protect his pride. Son, Harold said, you didn't have to come all this way. Ewan crossed the shed in 3 steps and knelt on the wooden floor in front of his father, the way he had kneeled in front of him at 9 years old, when Harold was teaching him to tie a proper knot. He took his father's hand in both of his. Harold's hand was cold, too cold for a man sitting inside even a shed like this in October. Dad. He couldn't say anything else for a moment. He looked up at his mother, standing near the camp stove with her arms wrapped around herself, And the look on her face was the one parents work to hide from their children, long after their children are old enough to see it. The look of someone who has been afraid for a very long time. "We didn't want to worry you," she said. Her voice was steady. John Carruthers had always held her voice steady even when nothing else was. "You were doing so well, you were busy." "Mom. We thought," Noel was helping. Ewan closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, Harold was looking out the small window toward the house. The porch light was on. Someone inside had turned it on. "What happened?" Ewan asked. Harold was quiet for a long moment. The October wind found every gap in the planking and came through all of them. "Noel came back in the spring. Said he'd found out there were some old debts on the property. A loan I'd co-signed years ago for a man at my old company. The man defaulted. Noel said if I didn't sign things over, the bank would take it anyway." Harold paused. His voice had the roughness of something worn down by long use in hard weather. "He said he'd manage the settlement and we'd have the house back by autumn. And instead, he rented it." Harold's jaw set. "We didn't find out until July. He said the rent would go toward the debt. Said we could stay in the shed in the meantime." In the meantime. As though a garden shed in Ontario in October were a reasonable in the meantime. As though two people in their late 60s with bad knees and nowhere to be warm were a problem that could wait for a more convenient arrangement. Ewan looked again at the tin of cold soup. He looked at the guest room blanket. He looked at the photograph lying face down in the cardboard box, and did not need to turn it over to know. It was the one from the living room wall. Harold and Jean at Lake Superior the summer before Ewan was born. Both of them young, and laughing with the whole rest of their lives in front of them. "He has the papers," Harold said. "It's all legal." Ewan said, "Is it?" Harold looked at him. "A lot of things look legal at first, that doesn't mean they hold." Ewan rose and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The contract was still there. He set it on the shelf next to the cold tin of soup gently and looked at his father. "I need to go speak to Noel." Harold grabbed his arm. "Ewan. I'm not going to do anything that makes it worse. You don't know what you'll do when you see him." "I know exactly what I'm going to do," Ewan said. "I'm going to let him talk. And then I'm going to listen to every word very carefully. Because every word Noel Carruthers says is going to be something a lawyer needs to hear." The back door of the house still used the same lock it had always used. And Ewan's key still opened it. Which told him something about how thoroughly Noel Carruthers had thought this through. His brother was in the kitchen with a coffee mug and an expensive pullover. And for a moment he simply stared at Ewan with the expression of a man who has been expecting a reckoning. But had convinced himself it would arrive in a more manageable form. "You have a key," Noel Carruthers said. "Apparently." Ewan stood in the kitchen his father had built, the room with the same window above the sink, and the same crack in the plaster by the fridge that Harold had been meaning to repair, and he looked at the coffee maker and the mat by the door, and the hook above the entrance where no winter hats hung, because this was not the Wright family's kitchen anymore. Not the way it used to be. "You should have called," Noel Carruthers said. "I was in the neighborhood." Noel set his mug down. 4 years older than Ewan, always the one who moved with certainty, who entered rooms as though they had been waiting. That quality was still present but wearing thin at the edges. "They told you," he said. "Some of it, why don't you tell me the rest?" Noel Carruthers folded his arms. "The debt was real, I have documentation. Dad co-signed a loan over a decade ago and the borrower defaulted. By March it had accrued to the point where the property was genuinely at risk. I found out and I stepped in. And then rented the property to someone else. The rent covers the settlement costs." "For how long?" Ewan looked at him. "Noel, for how long have you been telling them the rent is covering the settlement?" His brother looked out the window. The same window Harold had stood at for 40 years watching the same yard. The shed was visible from here, its battery lantern a small yellow rectangle against the gray of the October garden. "The timeline became more complicated than I initially projected," Noel Carruthers said. Ewan said nothing for a moment. Then, "They are eating cold soup out of a tin in that shed. Dad's hands are cold enough that I'm worried about his circulation. That is not a complicated timeline. That is what you decided was acceptable." He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "I want every document. The original loan records, the transfer agreement, everything they signed. Copies, delivered to me, by tomorrow morning." Noel Carruthers looked at him with the calculation of a man totaling costs. "And if I don't? Then I hire someone who is very good at finding what people have decided not to share. And I start with every neighbor on this street who's been watching this happen for 6 months and feeling guilty about it." Ewan looked at his brother one final time, at the face he had known all his life. The same gray eyes, the same jaw, a family resemblance that felt different now than it ever had before. "The papers, tomorrow morning." He walked back across the garden and knocked on the shed door once before opening it. Jean had put the soup on the camp stove. The small blue flame was working against the cold, and the smell of it, tomato, the particular brand they had always bought, because Harold said real tomato soup should taste like tomatoes and not like a suggestion of tomatoes, filled the shed with something that felt, against everything, like warmth. Ewan sat on the floor with his back against the shelving and looked up at his parents. Harold had the signed contract in his hands. He had taken it from the shelf and was holding it carefully. The way he held things that mattered, as though the paper could feel the importance of being handled correctly. Ewan, Harold said, reading. He said it quietly twice. "It's enough to get you out of here tonight," Ewan said. "And enough for a lawyer who is going to read every page Noel Carruthers signed and find the thing that's wrong in it. Because there is something wrong in it. There always is when someone takes what doesn't belong to them and writes a reason for why it does." Jean filled both mugs with soup and handed Harold his first. She set the second within Ewan's reach. Then she sat on the camp stool and looked at her sons. One sitting on a cold floor, one reading a contract by lantern light, and for the first time that evening she did not look like a woman holding herself together through effort. She looked like someone who had finally been allowed to set something heavy down. Ewan called the best property lawyer in the city from the floor of his parents' garden shed. She answered on the second ring and listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said 3 things. She wanted every document Noel Carruthers had produced. What Ewan was describing raised serious concerns about the validity of any property transfer signed by elderly individuals without independent legal counsel, and under conditions of financial pressure. And Harold and John Carruthers were not the first couple this had happened to. And she was glad someone had come home when they did. He thanked her and ended the call. Then he called Ray Fenton and asked to borrow the truck. Ray said yes before Ewan finished asking. An hour later, Harold and Jean Carruthers walked out of the shed into the cold October night. Harold stopped at the gate and looked back. At the shed, at the lit windows of the house beyond it, at the stars beginning to show above the flat line of the Ontario countryside. He stood straight, the way he had always stood. Not the straightness of a man trying to appear larger than he was, but the straightness of a man who had decided long ago that how you carried yourself was the last thing anyone could take from you, and had simply never let go of that decision. Ewan put a hand on his shoulder. Harold nodded once and got in the truck. The hotel room was warm and unremarkable, which was the most beautiful thing about it. Jean sat on the edge of the bed nearest the window with a cup of tea from the hallway machine. Harold sat in the chair by the heater with his hands wrapped around his own cup, the warmth slowly returning to his fingers. Ewan sat on the floor between them. He told them what would happen next. The lawyer, the documentation, his suspicion that the transfer had corners cut that would not survive scrutiny, that an aging man who had signed papers without legal counsel under explicit financial pressure had rights that Noel Carruthers had counted on his parents not knowing about. He told them about the contract, the Heritage Restoration Project, the building that would still be standing in 100 years, the commission that would allow him to do all of this without hesitating. Harold listened with his eyes on the floor. When Ewan finished, he said, "You don't have to spend your money on this. I know. This is your future." "You're my future," Ewan said. "You and Mom, everything I've built started in that house with you. I didn't become someone who wins commissions like this by accident. I know where it came from." He looked at his father. "Let me give some of it back." Harold's face went through something complicated and quiet. He looked at Jean. Jean looked at him. Between them passed the understanding that 40 years builds between two people. Wordless, complete, beyond the need to be explained. "Okay," Harold said. Ewan stayed until both of them had eaten. He stayed until his mother fell asleep, which she did quickly, as though her body had been waiting weeks for a room where it was safe to let go. He stayed until his father's breathing slowed in the chair, and Harold's tea sat finished, and the heater clicked steadily against the cold coming in from the parking lot. Then Ewan stood at the window and looked out at the dark highway, and the Tim Hortons sign across the road burning orange in the October night, and the flat black sweep of the Ontario countryside beyond it, and he thought about the house on Birchwood Crescent with its borrowed porch light, and about Noel Carruthers standing in their mother's kitchen with his careful mathematics of debt and timeline and settlement cost, and about what it meant to look at your own parents and decide that a garden shed in October was close enough to acceptable. He thought about what his father had said on the phone call 3 months ago, the one Ewan had almost cancelled because of a deadline, the one he'd kept to 10 minutes because the drawing was waiting. "Everything's fine. Everything's fine." The careful words of a man trying not to be anyone's burden, which was the most Harold Carruthers thing his father had ever done, and also the thing that had come closest to costing them everything. The next morning, Ewan knocked on his parents' door and asked if they wanted breakfast. Harold answered with his hair combed and his collar straightened, which meant he had not given up on himself, which meant that whatever Noel Carruthers had taken, he had not managed to take that, which meant there was still something solid to build the rest of it on. "Ready?" Ewan asked. Harold said, "I've been ready for a while." They walked to the coffee shop across the road together, the three of them, under a sky that had cleared overnight into the particular blue that only shows up in Ontario in October, the blue that arrives after the hard weather passes and stays just long enough to remind you what it looked like before the cold came in. Some things had been taken: a house, 6 months, an autumn's worth of dignity that should never have been asked for in the first place. Those were real losses, and Ewan was not foolish enough to believe that lawyers and money could make them entirely whole. But his parents were warm, they were fed. They were walking beside him in the morning light with their shoulders no longer braced against something invisible. And the work ahead was hard, but it was honest work. The kind Harold had always understood. The kind where you show up every day until the thing is done, and you do not ask anyone to admire you for it, and at the end you can say it was yours. Ewan had learned that from watching. He had learned it so early and so thoroughly, that he had almost forgotten it was something he had been taught. He remembered it now.